Ave Maria, and welcome to Divine Poetry, a series that explores the chronological parallels between the history of the Catholic Church and the Old Testament. If you're new to this concept, go back and watch my interview with Kevin Davis. The link is in the video description below. To make things more simple, I have divided up church history and the Old Testament into 8 color-coded time periods. Below you can see a scrolling bar with the names, dates, and the Old Testament books for each period. Use this timeline to guide you in each video. The color frame of each video will match the time period that we're discussing. Now, let's start today's episode. Hello, I'm Dominic, and welcome to episode 35 of Divine Poetry. In honor of the feast of St. Francis of Assisi on October 4th, only a couple days ago, I thought I would make this video for you about the parallels between King Solomon and St. Francis of Assisi. They seem very odd and not an obvious comparison, but it's really neat. Years ago, when I first started to see these parallels or realized them, however I want to say it, I never really decided how I want to phrase that, but I was putting my youngest boys to sleep, and I asked God if he could show me some of the parallels for their patron saints. I have a son named Francis, and so within a couple hours of making that prayer, I was really kind of struck with a really neat way of seeing St. Francis and King Solomon, which I'll share with you now. And at the end of this video, I have an account written in the 1300s by Angelo Clorano, who was a biographer of St. Francis 100 years after the fact. And he relates a story where St. Francis had a vision about how he and his order were like the statue of Nabucodonosor. If you remember that statue where the head is gold and the chest is silver and such. I have a video on this, the statue, a couple months back, which I'll link to in the comment section. And I didn't make that video in relation to St. Francis. I made it in relation to the parallels between church history and the Old Testament. But there's a separate understanding of the statue that St. Francis was given by an angel, per the biographer of Angelo Clorano. So I'll share that with you as well. So let's start off at the beginning here. I have maybe like 5 or 6 main parallels between St. Francis and King Solomon. The first one is going to be the relationship to wealth and wisdom. So King Solomon, at the very beginning of his kingdom, of his reign, I should say, he had a dream in which God asked him what he would like from God, and King Solomon chose wisdom. Whereas St. Francis had a chance to renounce all his wealth and was given holy wisdom. So I'm going to read 2 accounts. One's going to be from the life of St. Francis of Assisi, from Thomas of Solano in the early 1200s, and I'll read the Old Testament text, and then we'll go from there. Then he led the son to the bishop of the city to make him renounce into the bishop's hands all rights of inheritance and return everything that he had taken. Not only did he not refuse this, but he hastened joyfully and eagerly to do what was demanded. When he was in front of the bishop, he neither delayed nor hesitated, but immediately took off and threw down all of his clothes and returned them to his father. He did not keep even his trousers on, and he was completely stripped bare before everyone. The bishop, observing his frame of mind and admiring his fervor and determination, got up and, gathering him in his own arms, covered him with the mantle he was wearing. He clearly understood that this was prompted by God, and he knew that the action of the man of God, which he had personally observed, contained a mystery. So again, St. Francis renounces all his wealth, and in doing so, he gains arguably he's immensely rich spiritually. There's accounts, I couldn't find this at the time of recording, but there's accounts of friars going to see St. Anthony of Padua, and St. Anthony of Padua was a little bit taken aback at their rags and their poverty. But they were telling him at the time, he was an Augustinian monk at the time, St. Anthony was, and they were reveling in how rich they were spiritually. And so this is another example of how the Franciscans, in giving up everything, they gained everything. So, of course, King Solomon was the opposite of that in some way. He did not ask for wealth. So in a sense, he did renounce the idea of having wealth because he didn't ask for it. But he was given incredible wealth in the Old Testament, as we know, and also wisdom besides. So this is from the book of 2 Paralipomenon, and this is the account of his dream. Give me wisdom and knowledge, that I may come in and go out before thy people. For who can worthily judge this thy people, which is so great? And God said to Solomon, because this choice hath pleased thy heart, and thou hast not asked riches or wealth and glory, nor the lives of them that hate thee, nor many days of life, but hast asked wisdom and knowledge to be able to judge my people, over which I have made thee king. Wisdom and knowledge are granted to thee, and I will give thee riches and wealth and glory, so that none of the kings before thee nor after thee shall be like thee. Okay. Now, one of the other major themes of both St. Francis and King Solomon are that of the building of God's house. King Solomon was the one who built the temple. David wanted to build it, but God said, no, you have too much blood on your hands. Your son will build it. And Solomon did build God's temple. And of course, St. Francis of Assisi was told by God to rebuild my church. Or actually, the words that Thomas of Salona uses in his biography from the 1200s is rebuild my house. So it's even more impressive. Now, first I'm going to read from, this is St. Bonaventure, the life of St. Francis. He wrote again, and also about St. Francis. I believe St. Bonaventure was in the 1300s. And as with eyes full of tears he gazed upon the Lord's cross, he heard with his bodily ears a voice proceeding from the cross, saying thrice, Francis, go and repair my house, which as thou seest is falling utterly into ruin. Francis trembled, being alone in the church, and was astonished at the sound of such a wondrous voice. And perceiving in his heart the might of the divine speech, he carried out of himself in ecstasy. When at length he came unto himself again, he prepared to obey, and devoted himself wholly unto the behest to repair the material church. Howbeit the principal intent of the message had regard unto the church which Christ had purchased with his own blood. So St. Francis, of course, immediately, firstly, thought it meant to rebuild this church. It was the Portiuncula church, which was just outside of Assisi. So he actually rebuilt that physically. And of course, I think he later understands, or we also know, that he wanted God to rebuild the whole church, not physically, but spiritually. So then we have from the book of 3 Kings. This is just the account. We all know that King Solomon built the temple, but this is just where it states it in sacred scripture. And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of the reign of Solomon over Israel, in the month of Zeo, he began to build the house of the Lord. And of course, he did finish it 7 years later. Okay, so both St. Francis and King Solomon extended the kingdom. Under King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel was the largest it had ever been before and after that. He built fortified cities to protect the kingdom all the way up into Lebanon. So, it's past the traditional border that King David had for his kingdom. And similarly, St. Francis's order spread very quickly throughout Europe and also into Africa, into Syria as well. So he also extended the rebuilding of the church, so to speak, to a vast area very quickly. So first let me read from, I don't have a quote from this, but I'm just going to read what I wrote concerning this. During the life of St. Francis, and shortly after his death, there were over 5,000 friars in Europe, England, parts of Syria, and North Africa. It spread to almost every major European city very quickly during his life and after his death. And then, instead of reading this long text from the Old Testament, I'm just going to assert that King Solomon built many cities. It's easily verifiable. I'll just name some of them here really quickly. He also went into Emath Suba and possessed it. He built Palarmia in the desert. He built other cities at Emoth. He built up Beth Horon the upper and Beth Horon the lower. Balath also, he made strong cities. And all that Solomon had in mind and designed, he built in Jerusalem and in Lebanon, and in all the land of his dominion. So he just built and extended his reign. That's good enough. And now, another very amazing parallel between the two is that both King Solomon's kingdom and St. Francis's order divided into two immediately after their respective deaths. So in the, do I have anything for that? Okay, so I just, again, I don't have a quote from this because there's not one specific quote from the life of St. Francis that says this, but it's easily verifiable. After St. Francis's death, the brothers began to argue about how to interpret the role of St. Francis. So you had two major factions form, and they were forming actually in his life, but after his death, they broke apart. There was the Zalenti, or the spiritualists, and these are the ones who are more rigorous in the interpretation of poverty. And then you had the Relaxati, or the conventionalists, and they were the ones who were, I guess, a little more pragmatic, if I want to use that word. And they wanted to build up the order and build houses, and they needed money for that. They were accepting donations, and so they were kind of more of the hey, we have to live in the real world here. But the Zalenti wanted to really strictly observe that poverty, and so they did split. And I think Saint Bonaventure became the head of the order of the Relaxati, if I'm correct. And I think the Pope sided with the Relaxati as well. I'll fact check myself after I produce this video, and I'll put if I'm right or wrong, I'll put it on the screen. But I think that's how that went. And similarly, King Solomon's kingdom was divided after his death. That's, of course, the 10 northern tribes of Israel broke away under Jeroboam, and they started a whole new kingdom in the north. So that's very significant. Okay, now this is a one that's kind of more. Let's see. Well, it's amazing, but it's well, I'll just read it. All right. So both King Solomon and Saint Francis. I don't know how to phrase this, but I guess King Solomon's preeminent wife was the daughter of the Pharaoh. I mean, she was the one who had the most prominence, she was the most high-profile wife, the daughter of a pharaoh. So King Solomon he brought her first to the city of David, which would be Jerusalem, but then he started to build another house for her separate because he didn't want this Gentile woman to live in the city of David, which was a city for the Jews. So he built her a separate house away from that. I think it was in a place called Mello. Yeah, was it Mello? It was somewhere I never heard of before. But anyway, St. Francis of Assisi he didn't have a wife, of course, right? But he had his most high-profile female follower was St. Clare. And similarly, St. Clare was first brought to an Augustinian convent to protect her from and keep her away from her family who was trying to get her back. But in the meantime, when she was there, St. Francis and his brothers repaired San Damiano, and they brought her eventually to that, where that became the first permanent home of the poor Clares. So let's see here. I have these two quotes, just in case you want some documentation for that. Francis placed Clare in the convent of the Benedictine nuns in San Paolo, near Bastia, her father, along with other members of her family, attempting to convince her to return home. Okay. And then later on, it says that the sisters remained with the Benedictines until a small dwelling was built for them next to the church of San Damiano, which Francis had repaired some years earlier. So you still have the same idea of the, again, I don't know how to phrase it, right? But the most high-profile woman associated with Solomon and with St. Francis had a first house, then a second house. Now, here's a little side note here, is that King Solomon, of course, married, one of the things that caused his downfall was that he married so many pagan wives. And then he was kind of roped into and pressured into allowing pagan worship in Israel and also performing some of the pagan acts himself. So Solomon was ruined by the women that he had around him, and it caused his downfall. They took him off of the path of God's path and God's covenant, and they ruined him. But juxtaposed to that is St. Francis, who had a whole different opposite outcome. So the poor Clares would pray for the Franciscans and make sure they didn't fall off of the narrow path. So that's pretty neat. I mean, yeah, that's pretty neat. Okay. And I guess I'll just quote here very quickly the Old Testament concerning that. And the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. He made affinity with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. He took his daughter and brought her into the city of David until he made an end of building his own house in the house of the Lord and the wall of Jerusalem round about. So after he brought it into the king of David and he built his own house first, then, it says later, and the daughter of Pharaoh came out of the city of David to her house, which Solomon had built for her. Then did he build Mello. All right. Okay, so there's more parallels between King Solomon and St. Francis, but they're not so easily quotable. This one idea, for instance, was that King Solomon was the greatest king in some respects in the Old Testament. And apart from the Holy Family, Our Lady, St. Joseph, it's been said, and many people argue that St. Francis was the greatest saint in Catholic history. Now, I don't know, there's no way to quantify that, but it's pretty neat. And they're both greatly renowned as well. And there's some other smaller, kind of more abstract parallels, but I'll just leave it there. So, moving on to the statue dream of Nabucodonosor and St. Francis. I'm going to read the account here from the 14th century writer Angelo Clarano, who was himself a Franciscan. And after that, I'll make some comments on it. The angel said to him, this is a little bit lengthy, so make yourself comfortable. The angel said to him, "Why are you astonished and amazed? The form that you see in me represents the beginning, development, and end that your religion will experience until the time of its birth in the reformation of the life of Christ and of the ecclesiastical state." Very mysterious. "You with all your companies who are filled with the love of God, who carry Christ and his death in body and heart, you pray unceasingly day and night for the salvation of yourself and of all, weeping over your sins and the sins of others, and wanting to have nothing other under heaven for love of him. You are the head of gold." Speaking to St. Francis. "Those who will come after you, setting aside prayer, will concern themselves with knowledge that puffs up, and study of the written word, the building up of a large number of books, will set aside a love and zeal for poverty, all under the pretext of the salvation of souls and the edification of others. And because they put words before virtues, knowledge before holiness, they will not prosper, but will remain inwardly cold and empty of love, having exchanged gold for cold, porous silver." So now we're on to the silver part of the statue. "And because they will speak much and do little, they will begin to trample on the firmness of humility and their basic nature, namely the reality of poverty, and by taking on instead cares, worries, and distractions, they will change silver into iron." So we're going to go back to what comes in the statue next is, it goes from silver to brass. It's going to mention brass in a second. "They will not be concerned to return to the first goods of perfection, namely devout prayer and the fervor of love, but will display exteriorly ways of acting that are religious, humble, and of great holiness. However, interiorly, they will foster relaxations and will long for praise and honor, not being better and holier than all others, but wanting to be thought of and appear as such. And so, doing much harm like incompetent traders, they will do their work and change the silver eloquence and knowledge into a bronze and hypocritical image, so as to win human praise and temporal gain." Now we're in bronze. "And because their presence and hypocrisy will not remain hidden for a long time, they will become worthless in the eyes of their admirers. When they realize this, they will become indignant and angry against those whom they try to please, and from impatience they will more carefully seek out occasions to persecute and afflict those who have ceased to show them reverence and approval. So they will change the noisy and reddish bronze into the hard and rough iron." Now the bottom of the statue, of course, is the clay mixed with iron in the 10 toes, which I will make a comment on in a second. "Changed into an iron-like nature, they will be ready and bold, not only to excuse themselves of the injuries they have caused, but also to inflict harm on the innocent and to tolerate injuries they inflict on the timid, weak, and impatient. And as you see the iron mixed with clay in my feet, so finally there will be brothers swift and hard as iron, and inflicting harm on those who disagree with them, but weak and impatient as clay in endurance. In this way, those who in the beginning were clothed with the most pure gold of love of Christ will be regarded as earthen vessels in the final days when the religion founded by you will come to birth." Okay, so the statue dream of Nabucodonosor is told to Daniel in the Old Testament to be a prophecy of all the kingdoms that will rule the ancient world until the coming of Christ. And so then in the footnotes of the Douay Rheims Bible book of Daniel, it interprets those kingdoms. And we have who they are. We have the head is about, it says in the actual words in the text that the head of gold was the king Nabucodonosor. And then the Persians were the silver, or Persians were the silver, the Greeks were the bronze, the Romans were the iron. And during the time of the terracotta, iron, and clay toes, our Lord was born. And he was the rock that was hewn from the mountain in the prophecy that shattered the statue. And I pointed out in a video I made a couple months ago that because the Old Testament parallels church history, event for event in chronological order, that we can run that same prophecy of the statue dream again, but you use the parallels for those empires. So the Old Testament empire of the Babylonians is the French Revolution and Napoleon, and so there's the head of gold. And then you can go through one by one and find all those empires on the European or global stage, and you come to the European Union being the new Roman Empire, at least in Europe. It's hard to explain in one quick sentence. Anyway, it appears then that based on that kind of chronology of paralleling the Old Testament empires to the New Testament empires, that it looks like we're at the time when the statue will be shattered again, presumably by the second coming of Christ. But what's interesting here is that St. Francis is told that his order specifically is also like this statue, where St. Francis was the head of gold, which is easily understandable. Now, on the statue, you have 10 toes, right? So the toes are terracotta, iron mixed with clay. And right now, you have all kinds of different orders of Franciscans in the Novus Ordo and all over the place. And they range from all kinds of ideals. Some are more liberal, some are very, very liberal, some are more conservative. But just like how you have left and right toes on your foot, you have left and right leaning Franciscan denominations now. So very much you can see that it looks like we are at the toes of the statue in terms of just looking at the Franciscan order. That's probably more than I need to say. It's just interesting. It was related a little bit to St. Francis and King Solomon, because King Solomon also was like a head of gold. Okay, anyway, have a great week. Ave Maria, glory be to God, and look forward to videos in the upcoming months that I hope to showcase some of the parallels that we might see between the Year of 4 Emperors and what I'm thinking will be the Year of 4 Presidents. Anyway, have a good week.